Today, I'm joined by Dr. Tara Porter, who is a clinical psychologist with 25 years' experience. She's a Sunday Times best-selling author and has just written a new book, Good Enough, a framework for modern parents. Tara, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me. Tara, if you don't mind, I know you said you're a clinical psychologist, but for anybody who's listening who doesn't know what that entails, can you tell me a little bit more about what you do in your career?
Yeah, so I've been a clinical psychologist for almost 30 years now, and I've worked most of that time in child and adolescent mental health services in the NHS. And so I am seeing distressed children and their families in different settings. So sometimes I've seen them on paediatric wards, sometimes I've seen them in psychiatric hospitals, sometimes I've seen them in outpatient clinics. And in my final NHS role, I was the lead psychologist for a CAMS eating disorder service, which covered most of North London. So we'd get referrals from all over North London, and we'd see them for therapy, we'd see them for treatment, and I'd manage and supervise the other psychologists on the team as well. I have a couple of side hustles, but one of my side hustles is mental health in schools, which I'm really passionate about. I work for the Anna Freud Centre, who have a Schools in Mind project, and I wrote for the Times Educational Supplement, which is a journal for teachers. And so I write a lot about mental health in schools.
So it sounds like with everything you're doing there, you've got a really good insight into how child and adolescent mental health is changing, especially with the work that you're doing in schools. What have you noticed over this past 20 years in terms of the changes with the issues that we're seeing with young people?
Well, I think that we all know that there's many more children struggling with mental health, right? I mean, there's also less stigma around mental health. It's something that we have to explain. When I started 30 years ago, people didn't really know what a psychologist was. Now, I think people do know much more. So there's a huge increase in the number of young people suffering, struggling with going to school, struggling with anxiety, struggling with eating disorders. And I think there's a huge increase. I think that's linked to a huge increase of pressure generally. So my latest book, I sort of track that as a sort of perfect storm of pressure. And the pressure is coming from all different places. But of course, one of the places it's coming is from screens and social media. And the young people I see feel a lot of distress, and how we label that distress, what diagnosis we give it, isn't really the main issue, because the distress itself is the sort of feeling that they're not feeling good enough, and they feel an enormous amount of pressure to live up to different people's standards and expectations. So that's what I see a lot. And people seek a diagnosis a lot of the time because they feel like they can't manage that pressure. They feel like there's something wrong with them. And they want that understood better.
And I think with young people these days, they don't get a break from that pressure. It's not just at school anymore. It's in the bed with them at home, isn't it? If they've got their devices with them, because they're always contactable, they're always seeing what's going on. And it's not just pressure, I think, from others around them. It's pressure almost from this unrealistic ideal which is portrayed online, which may or may not be true. How do you think it's affecting eating disorders?
Yeah, that is one area though where the research is pretty strong, actually. When you look at the research on screens, because it's been such a relatively new phenomenon in research terms, and because the apps and programs are always changing, it's really hard to keep up to date in terms of research. But the research on the impact on body dissatisfaction of viewing so-called perfect bodies is pretty much unequivocal at this point. There's been masses of research showing that viewing so-called perfect bodies, in glamour shots, in kind of, fashion model shots, but also in fitness shots, impacts on how people compare, and they feel worse because they think they're not as good. And even though they know that lots of those photos are doctored, even if they know that, it still impacts on their self-esteem and their satisfaction with their body, which is one of the contributory factors to creating an eating disorder. So when I go back to what I was just saying, that people don't feel good enough, so they don't feel good enough in their body, they don't feel fit enough or attractive enough, or their thighs are too big, and that's a distress. And one of the obvious ways they deal with that distress is starting dieting, which can lead, dieting is a sort of a mechanism by which you develop an eating disorder, either by dieting and then tipping into sort of binge eating when you're really hungry, or by setting conditions for anorexia to develop.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's something that I've heard from quite a lot of professionals, is that they're really seeing, like you say, the research is there. I think people are seeing it who work on the ground, so anecdotally we're seeing it, but the evidence base is there about the impact of this.
Interesting. I was just reading some research yesterday, which I'm not very familiar with, but I just read it for the first time, so I'm not going to talk at length about it. But showing that also it impacts on the other way, that when kids see masses of, the research was with influencers, sort of teen influencers who eating food high in fat and sugar, that can have an impact on developing, big kids becoming overweight. So it's, it's a double-edged sword.
I think what's happening is that they're being influenced by the wrong people into behaviours which maybe we as parents wouldn't be wanting our child to go down. And it's so subtle because it's going in almost unconsciously, I think, as you sit and scroll. You don't really realise how it's impacting you or your child. I mean, even as an adult, I feel like that when I'm looking at things. And I know I should know what's going
Should
on.
know, should we?
I
But
should know, especially with working in it, but still gets me as well. So you can I can imagine how, for a young child or for teenagers, how when your identity isn't quite yet formed, how it does have an impact. And the work that you're doing in schools regarding mental health, what do you do there? What do you tackle?
I talk a lot about the impact of perfectionism on young people, really. So, mostly to parents, sometimes to teachers, sometimes to young people. Kids are sort of bombarded with ideas about perfectionism all around them, and it seeps into and we were talking about the sort of external pressures a moment ago, but of course, what we know as psychologists, that those external pressures seep in, become your own internal pressure. So lots of the young people I see, it's almost like they've almost lost what they think about anything in their own head. So when as a psychologist, I'm trying to sit with what they're experiencing in their mind, and what they're experiencing in their mind is this constant verbal narrative of, am I good enough? They think I'm stupid. They think I look fat. I wonder, is my teacher happy with me? Is my mum disappointed with me? How do I make this person like me? And it's this constant looking outward. And when I ask kids, well, when are you free from that? Or teenagers particularly, they're almost never free of it. The distressed teenagers I'm seeing. And I want to give them those opportunities where they can just be and not feel like they're being reviewed the whole time. We know that teenage years are the peak times. The task of adolescent years is to sort of separate from your parents and individuate as a person. And we know that it's an evolutionary wiring that teenagers start to move away from their family of origin and they look to their peer group. They're making a peer group, and that's important, right? We all of our time, and when we meet people of our age, even as an adult, we might reminisce about things we did in TV shows we watched, all sorts of stuff. So teenagers are in that process. They're making their own peer group, making their own generation in a sense. So they are looking out all the time. But I think that, I do see distressed teenagers in clinic, but I think it's a zeitgeist issue. I think we've all moved along that sort of spectrum of looking to the opinions of others or comparison. And I think it's been a sort of systematic kind of move. There's a whole system of a generation that looks more to that.
We know that the stage of adolescence is already is challenging without devices, without that pressure of devices and screens and everything being recorded and all of these unrealistic expectations. And also all these people that portray themselves to have great wealth or amazing success. That can probably feel quite disheartening to a young person who's trying to look to the future about where they're going to go. How aware do you think teens are of the impact of this pressure? Do you think they're aware of that?
Yeah, I think they're getting more aware, but I don't think they're very aware. And I say in my book that, nearly every parent who brings a teenager to see me says, oh, it's the blooming phone, in some way, that they include the phone in the evolution of the problem that the young person's coming to see me for. But a young person very rarely comes and says, oh, it's the phone. I'm on the phone, I'm comparing. But I do see it as we unpick their problem. I do see how the phone has played its part in the start of their problem, or contributed to how it's played out, how their feelings are. And I guess what I see is I call it a perfect storm, because I think there's the zeitgeist change that I'm talking about is how there's been a difference in how we raise children, how we educate children. So were much more focused on outcome. So, the phones impact on parents as well, don't they? When you're a young parent trying to do the best for your kid, and you're looking online and you're looking for tips, and there's so many tips, and there's sort of a standard that parents feel they have to live up to. And then when we go into education, I think the education system has become much more focused on testing kids and on qualification, so on outcome. And what I see with young people is that many kids really take that pressure to heart and work really hard, but there's a group of kids, about 30% of kids don't get any maths and English GCSE, and these kids are really disenfranchised from life. Now, on their social media, what they'll be getting is images of great wealth and aspiration. And so there's a real disparity there. There isn't a sort of normal comparison group where education isn't giving them much of a way out of that, because not many kids don't get the grades, so they haven't got the hope that they're going to achieve through getting kind of the normal route of getting a good job and then progressing in that job. But the social media gives them something to aspire to, which is then unreachable, and how that leads kids to feel disenfranchised. And I think that mindset is one of the ones that contributes to a lot of the truancy we see, and a lot of the emotional based school avoidance that we see. So it's the mix of the different factors that I think is really crucial.
Yeah, if for anyone listening, because I have spoken to quite a lot of people who are struggling with getting their children into school. So, what do you have any advice on that? If we've got children who are at home refusing to go in, what would you say to any parents who are struggling with that?
I think it's a really hard one, because I think the parents end up at the epicenter of that pressure, really, because they're receiving the pressure from schools. They can even get fined for not taking their kid to school, and then they're seeing their young person's distress. And I think what I think is really important, it is giving kids like a pathway, like a future. So we're talking about that kind of aspirational culture that we see on social media, and we have to give kids like, what's my pathway through life? Because if they're not achieving at school, they don't see that they've got a pathway. And so then I think it's about giving them different ideas. And I talk a lot about a sort of zigzag academic and career pathway, because most of us in our careers haven't had a career that's gone straight up. I'm using my hand here, which doesn't work very well on the podcast, but it's not going up in a sort of straight diagonal line up, is it? We're going in a zigzag path up. We have wins when we get our exams, but then sometimes we don't get a job, or we fail something. And so giving kids that kind of narrative can really take some of the anxiety out of it, and trying to think about what they can do, what they can't do. Yeah.
We need to teach them to fail, don't we? I think that teaching that failure is okay, and there is a lot of pressure on the G. I mean, I didn't come from a typical background myself. I was unwell during my GCSEs, so I had to do them a year later at college. I didn't get A levels. I was lucky that the job I was in my early 20s supported me into a degree in psychology, and then from there on went degree, master's, doctorate. There are other ways into things, but I do remember the pressure that was on me, and I remember the pressure of being, if you don't get your GCSEs, you'll end up working in Woolworths.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or McDonald's. That's what I was told.
Yeah, exactly. I love hearing stories like that. Thanks for sharing that, Charlotte. And it's amazing when you talk to people when I say about zigzag, career paths, nearly everyone says, "Oh yes, I did it this way," or my mate did it this way and he was really successful. So I think we have to keep that open for kids. I see a lot of kids, particularly, I don't work in the NHS anymore, but I did for 28 years when I was working there, who were so mentally unwell that they had to take some time out and missed chunks of their education, and then we got them back on that route of education, or they took a different path, and that's okay. And I think there's a huge amount of panic. Obviously education is important, schools are important, but there's can be a huge amount of panic, and a panic in parents, which means that and panic is contagious. Yeah, so as a parent, trying to keep your head when all around are losing theirs and probably blaming it on you is really difficult.
Yeah, I agree with you about what you said just then, but earlier as well, just about the pressure on parents to be perfect. I have to just shut a lot of these things off, because There's no way on earth, it's impossible to be the perfect parent. And like you say in your book, good enough, I love that, because it is about just being good enough, isn't it? I think your child doesn't need you to be perfect either, because that doesn't teach them to stand on their own 2 feet or to develop resilience. But these pressures that you see online, honestly, when you look online at social media, you almost think you can't breathe anymore, because you're not supposed to have coffee, you can't drink out of a coffee cup, you can't burn candles, you shouldn't use dishwasher tablets, you can't eat this, you can't eat that, your pet, you shouldn't be doing this with your child. It is so overwhelming as thinking about all of these things. What's right for my child? What's not right for my child? Am I doing enough? Am I not doing enough? Or, oh, I shouted then. Now they're going to be in therapy when they get older saying, my mum shouted at me when I was younger, because you're taught. And if you look at the online world and what it tells you, it's that you should always be calm and think and check your emotions. People just aren't like that.
No,
People
and
just aren't.
I'm under pressure at work too. Many more, families have two parents working now, or single parenting, and so you're under pressure to do that and to achieve your SMART goals at work and get things in on time and to answer your emails, and then you're meant to be at the school on time with the healthy snack, and you're meant to be taking them, doing their reading every night and practicing their phonics and taking them to these clubs and activities, and you're meant to do all of that and then have a healthy meal back when they get home, and then you're meant to have a calm and relaxing bedtime. I mean, it's impossible. No, and actually it was so interesting writing the book, because when you look at the literature on perfectionism in parents, and how that can pass down to children by creating a sort of anxious, future forward environment where parents are also looking at those sort of third person opinions about what they should be doing, that translates into the young person's mind. And we know that's terrible for mental health. So good enough is best in a way, because good enough provides flexibility. It's consistent and you've got opportunities, but it's not overwhelming, and it gives people like a springboard, which gives kids a springboard which they can jump into their lives.
Yeah, I agree. I think
So
it's good advice.
shouting is part of life. It prepares, your daughter for, that not everyone's going to be nice all the time, that other people have other feelings and nobody's perfect. And she's allowed to not be perfect too.
Yeah, good. That makes me feel better.
I know, me
Thanks for
craving
that
that.
mini session.
I might have a vested interest in that point of view, Charlotte. Who knows?
I think that is an important message to get across, isn't it? Because when you see all the content that's online, it says, you need to regulate your emotion before you do this with your child. Obviously, I'm a psychologist and psychotherapist myself, so I understand where it's coming from, but it's completely unrealistic.
It's unrealistic.
It's important that children understand the impact that their behaviors have on other people around them. They're learning about other people. They're learning what pushes people's buttons and how not to behave. So I do know people who say, oh, well, we try not to get upset in front of the child, or we didn't want them to see that we were upset that so-and-so died. My advice there is always, it's okay for your child to see this full range of emotions, because it tells them it's okay for them to feel that as well. But there's a lot of input going in from the online world. It's too
Lots
much.
of input, yes, and that thing about, of course, we know as psychologists it's best, and like shouting all the time is bad for your kids. There's no doubt about that. But if you set up a standard that you're never going to shout at your kids, so you're going to spend in the school holidays maybe 14, 16 hours a day with them, whatever it is, and you're never going to get cross or lose your temper. It's such an unrealistic standard. And then when you start, you feel yourself getting irritated, you go to a place of criticism. Oh, I shouldn't be feeling this. I should be, showing up for them emotionally. I should be regulating myself. And that's the thing that spirals then, you losing your cool even more, doesn't it? If you've got an unrealistic standard, if you've got a standard that, yeah, I'm human too, and sometimes I get cross, and sometimes you're very annoying, and sometimes I'm in a bad mood, and this is what life is like, then that is not a catastrophe when it happens. And, as you say, the rupture and repair is so important. But yeah, I think parents are subject to the same pressures as young people with vis-a-vis the screens in terms of these ideas about perfect parenting. And I talk in my book about how we want to be seen, that the phone has become almost like, a couple of generations ago, there was this sort of idea of your neighbours looking at you behind net curtains, and watching what you were doing. But in a sense, now the screen is watching what everyone's doing, isn't it? And it's become, you're trying to live up to everybody's standards, and it's It's really, really difficult.
You wouldn't breathe if you followed all the advice that's online. So I think with parenting, it's I allow myself some slack because I know I'm human. I'm doing the best I can. My daughter's doing well in school. She's a nice, lovely, kind human being, and I think that that's who I want her to be and to grow into. But I think it's that 80/20 rule, isn't it? As long as 80% of the time it's all going as you'd hope, good enough.
Good
If you
enough.
Good enough, right? And then you drop the ball for 20%. That's okay, obviously within reason with what that
Yes, within
20%
reason.
is. But yeah, it's allowing ourselves that sort of space to be human and flawed as parents as well, isn't it? You've got children, haven't you? Yeah. How old are your children?
24, 19, 17.
Okay, so they're probably at an age where they've had screens in their lives, but probably not in the very early developmental years. Would that be right to say? Well, not smart devices.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because my son, who's 24, was born in 2000, the year 2000, and that's generally the year where they say the smartphone was born as well. And he's now, and in fact, he came at the beginning of this session to give us some technical help because he's now a software engineer. So I really was at the first generation to be parenting with screens. And he is very, very computer literate and naturally attracted to all of that computer stuff. And it was difficult. It was really difficult. And I think I was, as a psychologist working with adolescents, really very much in touch with the problems that were going to come with the screens. I could see it playing out in my clinics. And so I was probably much firmer than most parents with screens. But it was a battle I often lost because, and this is something that I think is really important. I think I often came down too firm. So in my book, I talk about the 3 principles of parenting, the sort of good enough principle we've just been touching on, and then relationship-based parenting, and this idea of firm and kind, which in the literature is called authoritative parenting. But I think is quite a confusing word because you can confuse it with authoritarian. So I call it firm and kind parenting. And I think with my eldest, I came down much too firm. And that might be a surprise to you because obviously I'm saying there's lots of problems with the phone and the screens. But I think what I lost by being really firm is I lost some of the relationship. And I lost some of the ability to guide him and scaffold him and the conversations we could have had about it. I didn't lose those completely. I can still remember some good conversations we had, but it became like a war of attrition where he was wearing me down, being quite sneaky. So he's very, he's very technical. So if I turned off the Wi-Fi, this might not even be technically right. If he listens, he'll pick me up on it. But he could put it through a different IP address or something like that.
Yeah.
And this is what I see a lot in my clinical work. I see parents coming down really what I call sledgehammer firm with the phone and then they lose the ability to scaffold and guide. So if we think about other things that we were guiding our teenagers on, so I'm talking about teenagers, I'm not talking about when they first get a phone here, when they're younger, I'm talking about the teenage years. But when we think about those other things we guide them through, like alcohol use or learning to drive, we really give them a lot of scaffolding and help them. And I think with the phone, we're so aware of the damage that we can come down really firm and then they stop talking to us about it. They stop talking to us about the problems. And so when I see teenagers, and I've seen all sorts of horrors in clinic of kids getting into all sorts of difficulties on their phone, bullying, being assaulted, porn use, just horrible things. And when I sort of get it out of the young person, when I get it out of the teenager and they tell me about it, and I say, oh, why haven't you told your parent? And they say, because my parent would take the phone away. And the phone is a lifeline to them and they don't want it taken away. So that's the problem with sledgehammer firm. You have to know that they can come to you with the problems and they will make mistakes and that you can talk about it and negotiate it. And that's really important, I think, in the later teenage years.
That balance, striking that balance,
balance.
that is absolutely crucial. It's something that I'm trying to do myself and something I do talk about when I'm working with schools or families, is that if you're too hard, they're not going to feel safe coming to you because of the risk of you taking the phone away or it being a punitive response. want. So it's creating that space which is still open enough for them to come and talk to you about when things do go wrong. But also, it's a very difficult one with screens because I think the instinct is to say, I don't want you on this because I know how harmful it is. But then they want to be on it. And like you say with your son, our children are always going to be more advanced with tech than we are because of how fast it's moving and evolving. I know for a fact my daughter knows far more about any of it than I do. So me trying to put some controls on it will just be ridiculous for her. And she'd get around it. So it's more about actually asking her to make the right decisions herself, getting her to that point where she's making good choices herself. It's very difficult with these devices because we know how dangerous they can be. When I started writing Generation Zombie, it was about 3-4 years ago. We're now in a different space in terms of AI and what's happening there with young people building relationships with AI bots, people having therapy with AI.
I know, yeah.
And it's gone very, very wrong in some cases as well. So it's quite worrying what's going on. But even if you look at it on the lighter end, where people are doing their homework on it, so children aren't thinking anymore, they're going to Chat GPT and doing their homework on it. So trying to navigate this as a parent right now is quite a difficult one, really, because like you say, they want the phone, but the phone's not just the phone. It's got all of these other things on it, which are damaging not just their mental health or their relationships, but now their engagement with their education, or how much are they actually learning to think critically or learning their work because they're doing it all on a device. So it's difficult to get that balance, but like you say, it is about striking that balance, and I think education is key around that.
Mm.
If you were to give any advice to someone who was considering giving their child a device now, what would that be?
Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, because we talked about, with teenagers, keep it once they've got the device, how to keep the sort of relationship going. And I think when you think about devices, so we think about giving a younger child like an iPad to watch stuff or giving them a phone at 10 or 11. So we talk through both of those just a little bit. I think the thing about the iPad when they're very young is the thing I guess what I would think about is that we really don't want that to become the default. We don't want and the parents, that's one thing, and the second thing is that they have to be really aware of what the content is, and I would be really quite worried if they had sort of free range to the internet. So we know that the things like the iPad are incredibly magnetic to kids, and so they will always want it. It's the kind of pizza or chips version of dinner is something that they always are happy to have. So we have to be really careful about how we let them on it and how long they're on it for. And again, the concept of good enough is important here, and striking the balance, which we were just talking about with the older kids. And just to be aware of how sticky it is. The kids don't really understand time. Just keeping those boundaries, keeping the firmness, keeping the kindness, but also giving yourself a break if you sometimes need, as a good enough parent, to use it. I think with the phone, what I would be really aware of, I think there's two things I would say about giving the phone. So the age where kids are getting phones now tends to be the end of primary. It used to be at the start of secondary. It's now gone down to sort of year 6 or even year 5. And I think what can be really helpful is a kind of community response. So why kids want phones is because everyone else has got one. If only one kid had a phone, I mean, it would still be attractive for the gaming, but it wouldn't be that attractive because they couldn't talk to anyone else on it. So I think when parents get together and decide that, their kids in that class or their kids in that friendship group are only not going to have a phone, or they're only going to have a phone without the internet, like a non-smartphone, then that can be a really helpful response. And actually, that was something that happened all those years ago when I was parenting my now 24-year-old, that one of the mums said, okay, I'm not going to buy an expensive phone for my kid. And that set a standard, really, that then everybody else could kind of go, and we agreed that they'd all have the same sort of really basic phone. And there's a lot of research, you'll be probably familiar with the research in Norway about how taking phones out of schools as a whole school can have an impact on mental health, so having those community responses can be really good. The second thing about the phone is that before you give your kid the phone, you've got maximum leverage. After that, it's that kind of war of attrition, they're and they're wearing you down. So that's the time to be having those kind of firm but really kind conversations about what you expect from the phone. Not a kind of what I call a sledgehammer firm response, which is, if you take your phone to your bedroom ever, I'm going to take it away for a month, because then you're cutting down the relationship, which is the third thing I think is important in parenting, and you're losing the opportunities to scaffold and guide them. But you want to be saying, I don't want your phone in the bedroom. That's part of the phone contract. If I see your phone in the bedroom, I'm going to ask you to take it out, that sort of thing. And also, as part of that contract, to have that you will be monitoring their phone use for the first couple of years, and that's just a normal part of life. Because their phone isn't their diary. It's not the same as a diary. We sometimes think it is, but it's not. A phone is a portal to the whole of the rest of the world and everybody in the world, all the bad people, all the not good stuff, So you need to be monitoring that the first couple of years, and just that, be very laid back and very kind, but not to tell them off, because they will make mistakes. They're kids, they make mistakes. So in your phone contract with your kids, you have the three different factors, which are that you're going to keep monitoring their phone use and scaffolding and supporting them with their phone use, since it's not a private thing, and that it's a responsibility, and to go through some of those responsibilities, how a phone can take you away from sleep, how phone can be used to be mean to people, all those sorts of responsibilities. How phone, when you're walking down the street, you see so many kids on the phone, and it's just so worrying when they cross the road, isn't it? They're not looking properly. So that responsibility. And the third aspect, I would say, is about values. What values do you want represented by the phone? Because the phone can be used for really great stuff. It can be used for, for yoga apps, for creative apps, And so, like in my family, we had one of my values is that we eat together. There's no screens at the meal time, and that we still connect to each other and we still have conversations. So when they were younger, there was no screens in the car when we were going on short journeys. If we were driving to the south of France, then I'd let them have a screen occasionally, but not on a short journey. So those three things, I think, are really important.
That information and advice there, I think, is really useful for all parents, and it definitely echoes the sort of work that I do. I agree about that contract. It's setting those rules at the offset. I think we see it as just a phone, but we almost need to see it as if it's another world. So how do we parent in the real world? We need to parent in the online world with the same level of caution, don't we? Those three tips there were really, really useful. Tara, what we are seeing, the invasiveness of these devices everywhere. We cannot get away from them, even if we don't want a screen or a phone. We really can't get away from them. What is your biggest phone moan about how devices have taken over our lives?
Well, I think some of my biggest moans are those things we've talked about there, but my pet peeve really is the sort of what I call my book, the stickiness of them, the sort of magnetic stickiness of them, and that they're on the one hand, they're essential for life now, that somehow society has moved that I have to have a phone to park my car. I have a phone now for my calendar, which is integrated with my other work colleagues, all those sorts of things. So it's necessary, and yet it's really sticky. So I go on to look for the weather forecast about whether I need a coat, and then find myself doom scrolling new shoes, which I don't need, or something like that. Yeah, so I think that's it. And Instagram particularly is, incredibly addictive, I think. I'm not on TikTok, and the kids tell me that's even worse. That when you're on Instagram and TikTok, it's like a time vortex, isn't it? It's like all normal sort of senses of time where how 5 minutes feels goes out the window, and suddenly you can be half an hour in and it just feels like 2 minutes. So I think that's the thing, isn't it? They're really sticky, and that gets in the way of life. And it's
sticky
annoying.
is a good word. Sticky is a very good word. They are like that. But nobody can have control over that. I don't think that any of us have got the willpower to have that control over these things. I have to take the apps off the phone, or take mail off the phone, so I'm not checking my emails. And it's become such a compulsion now that I don't even know you're doing it. You pick it up, and then before you know it, like you say, an hour's gone. You've answered emails on a Saturday. You've been doing all sorts of things, and you've been influenced by somebody that you didn't even know 5 minutes ago.
Values you don't value,
Exactly.
who lives a different life to you.
Yeah, exactly. And then all of a sudden you feel bad that you haven't done 3 hours of exercise that morning.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for this conversation has been brilliant. And I think you've given some fantastic advice and insights. If people want to find out a bit more about you, Tara, where can they go?
Well, I am on the dreaded Instagram, I'm afraid. And then I've got a website which links to all my writing.
Yeah,
Stuff I'm talking about is in my book, the I'm good enough.
this
Yeah.
book, good enough. Fantastic. Good rules for parenting. And also
Oh, and
not too much
actually,
pressure.
in my previous book, You Don't Understand Me, I've written a chapter for young people about their phone use. So that if you want to give your kid that to talk about phone use, that's quite useful too.
I do think we need more of that advice targeted for younger people rather than just for parents, because it's
Exactly, yeah.
helping young people to navigate this. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, let's go out and have a nice phone-free weekend, shall we?
Yes, let's do that. Dr. Tara, thank you for joining me on this podcast
Been a pleasure.
today.
Thank you for listening to Generation Zombie, Raising Healthy Humans in a World of Devices and AI, with myself, Dr. Charlotte Armitage, and this week's guest, Dr. Tara Porter. If you'd like to find out more, you can visit www.generationzombie.co.uk, and you can also find us on Instagram and TikTok. We look forward to seeing you next week.